Ellen Vane poured the tea at the urn in the parlour where she had nursed Honoria for 4 winters. Across the room, a cousin she had met perhaps twice was being admired, not for herself, for the pearls at her throat. Still warm, those pearls, from the drawer they were lifted from that morning. Ellen did not weep. She refilled the pot. The cousin's name was Blanche Merrow. She had come from Stamford, over the county line, a line she had crossed twice in 15 years. Ellen had crossed the sickroom floor every single day of the last 4. Blanche turned the rope of pearls in the firelight so the whole room could see them shine. Honoria would have wanted them worn, she said, not shut away in a drawer. 30 mourners stood in a parlour built for 12. Every one of them nodded. Not one of them knew the woman pouring their tea. At the window a man set down his cup. The Reverend Josiah Merton, parish vicar, a plain man who hated a spectacle. He drew a folded paper from inside his coat. He had taken it down 3 weeks before the end, in Honoria's own words, with 2 neighbours' marks upon it. He did not open it yet. He only held it and looked across the room. And behind Blanche, on the mantelpiece, stood the one likeness Honoria ever sat for, a pale rope at her throat. The very same rope. No one looked at it but the vicar. And you. If you believe kindness never goes unnoticed, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I like to know who's listening. Now, back to that cold parlour in Rutland and the woman at the urn. Let me take you back 4 years, before any of them came. Because you have to know what Ellen gave before you can weigh what they tried to take. It was 1853, a wet spring in Nether Dunthorpe, a small market town in Rutland, England, the kind of town where everyone knows your business and no one knows your worth. Thistle House sat at the end of a lane, low and damp, with moss on the north wall and a chimney that smoked when the wind came round. Inside it lived Honoria Vane, 68 years old, dying by inches for 4 years and refusing to be quick about it. Honoria was born a Holt. The Holts of Nottingham, lace people. Once there had been money in the family, long ago, and pride longer than the money lasted. By the time Ellen knew her, the money was gone and only the pride remained, thin and clean as old linen. Honoria kept her back straight, even when her hands would not stay still. The shaking had started slow. A cup rattling in a saucer, a needle she could no longer thread. Then worse. She could not lift the kettle. She could not fasten her own dress. She could not rise from a chair without help, and there was no one in that house to help her. Ellen came then. Ellen Vane, widow of Honoria's nephew Thomas. Thomas was 3 years dead, taken by a fever that spared his wife and left her nothing but his name and his good watch. Ellen had no children. She had no money to speak of. When the word came that old Honoria was failing alone in that damp house, Ellen packed a single trunk and went. No one asked her to. No one paid her to. She was not a Holt by blood. She was not a Vane by anything but marriage to a dead man. She had no claim on that house, and no reason to be there but one. Kindness, plain kindness, and nowhere else to be. She learned to lift her. That is a harder thing than it sounds. You learn where to put your arm, how to take the weight without hurting the old shoulders, how to turn a body that cannot turn itself so the skin does not break. Ellen learned it in the dark, alone, night after night. She learned to read the Stamford paper aloud in a slow, even voice, because Honoria liked to hear what the world was doing even when she could no longer go and see it. She learned to keep the fire in through the small hours, because the cold got into Honoria's chest and frightened her. There was no wage. Let me say that again, so it sits with you. There was no wage. Ellen was never paid a penny for 4 years of it. There was no promise on paper either. No will she had seen. no deed with her name. Only a word, spoken once, on an evening when Honoria's hands were bad and her spirits low. Honoria had reached out and caught Ellen's wrist, and held it, and said, "The pearls are yours, Ellen. You'll know why." That was all. Ellen had not asked what she meant. You do not ask a dying woman to explain her kindness. You just say thank you, and keep the fire in. Now here is a thing I want you to hold on to, because it matters more than it looks. There came a month when the apothecary's account ran to 11 shillings. 11 shillings for the powders and the drops that kept Honoria's nights bearable. It does not sound like much now. It was a great deal then, in that house, with no income coming in. And Honoria fretted over it. She would lie awake and fret, because she had been raised to pay her debts, and now she could not pay this one, and the shame of it hurt her worse than the illness. So Ellen sold the watch. Thomas's watch, her dead husband's watch, the one good thing she had left of him, the thing she had carried out of her marriage and meant to keep till she died herself. She took it into town and sold it, quietly, and paid the apothecary the 11 shillings, and came home and told Honoria the account was settled and she was not to think of it again. She never told her how. Honoria died believing some small legacy had covered it. It was Ellen's dead husband's watch. Given away, expecting nothing back, not one thing, that is who was pouring the tea. Remember it. Honoria died on a Tuesday, quietly in the grey hour before the light came. Ellen was with her. Of course she was. She had been with her for 4 years. There was no gasp, no last grand word, just a breath, and then no breath, and Ellen sat holding a hand that had stopped shaking at last. She closed the old eyes. She washed the body herself and dressed it decently, because that was the last kindness left to do, and she would not hand it to a stranger. Then she sat by the cold fire and did not cry, because there was too much to do and no one to do it but her. And then the word went out, and the blood came. That is the way of it, isn't it? 4 years, and not one letter, not one visit, not 1 shilling toward the apothecary. And then the woman dies, and the road to Thistle House is suddenly busy with carts. Cousin Blanche Merrow of Stamford, 2 further cousins behind her, a family that had sent nothing through the long dying, now arrived all together for the funeral, in good black, with sharp eyes. Blanche came first, and Blanche came foremost. She was a handsome woman of 50, well-fed, well-dressed, with the kind of voice that fills a room, whether the room wants filling or not. She swept into Thistle House 2 days before the funeral, as if she owned it already, and perhaps in her own mind she did. She walked through the rooms. "Just to see it," she said, "just to see the dear old place." But Ellen watched her eyes, and Ellen saw that the eyes were not remembering. The eyes were counting. In the small back room, Blanche stopped at Honoria's writing table, where the rosewood workbox stood. A pretty thing, that workbox. Inlaid lid, brass fittings, a little tray inside for the needles and the silks. Honoria had kept it 40 years. Blanche picked it up, turned it over once, tucked it under her arm. "No one will miss this," she said, light as anything, and carried it out to her cart. Ellen said nothing. It was not hers to keep. But she saw it go. And then Blanche said the thing. Standing in the doorway of the bedroom, glancing in, "Careless as you please," she said. "The good rope's in the bedroom drawer, I dare say. The pearls." Just that. A throwaway line. She was already thinking of other things. But she had marked where they were, she had put them on her list. And Ellen heard her do it, and Ellen's stomach turned over, because Ellen knew what the pearls were, or half knew, and Blanche knew only that they were good. Here is what none of them saw. I want you to see it, because you are the only one in that house who will. Above the parlour fire, on the mantelpiece, stood a photograph in a black frame. The only likeness Honoria ever sat for in all her life. She had gone to the man in Nottingham in '48, and sat stiff and proud in her best dark dress, back straight, hands folded, looking at the lens as though daring it to flatter her, and at her throat, plain in the picture, catching what light the old plate could catch, was a rope of pearls. That rope. The very rope now lying in the bedroom drawer with Blanche's mark upon it in her mind. The photograph sat there all day, in plain view, above the heads of 30 mourners. And not one of them looked at it. Blanche walked past it a dozen times. The cousins set their cups down beneath it. It was furniture to them. It was nothing. But it was not nothing. It was a witness. A silent, patient witness, standing on the mantel, holding in its glass the truth of who those pearls belonged to and always had. You have seen it now. Keep your eye on it. The others will forget it is there. You must not. The funeral was on the Thursday. They buried Honoria Vane in the churchyard of Nether Dunthorpe under a sky that could not make up its mind to rain, and the Reverend Josiah Merton read the words over her in his plain, unhurried way. Ellen stood at the back, in her one good black, and no one thought to put her at the front where the family stood, and she did not ask to be. She had said her goodbyes in the sick room over 4 years, 100 small goodbyes. She did not need a front-row place at the grave to know what she had lost. And before the coffin had even left the churchyard, before the earth was well settled, the parlour clock went into a bag. I want you to feel the speed of it. One of the cousins, a thin man with a damp handshake, came back to the house ahead of the rest on some excuse, and when Ellen passed the parlour she saw him lift the mantel clock, Honoria's own clock, the one that had ticked through all those long nights, and slide it into a carpet bag. He caught her looking. He did not even colour. He simply said, "Family piece," as though that settled it, and buckled the bag. The clock that had counted out Honoria's dying hours, gone into a stranger's luggage before the flowers on the grave, had wilted. Ellen turned and went to see to the tea. What else was there to do? The tea had to be poured. The mourners were coming back to the house. That is the custom. The funeral tea. The whole town crowding into the dead woman's parlour to drink and murmur and eat the cake the neighbours brought. And in Honoria's house there was only one pair of hands to pour it. Ellen's. So she set the urn to heat, and she laid the cups, and she stood at her station like a servant in a house that had been her whole world. And she poured for people who did not know her name. And that is when Blanche came down the stair, wearing the pearls. You have to picture the room. 30 people in a space for 12. The fire built high against the damp. The low ceiling, the smell of wet wool and strong tea, and the sweetish smell of funeral cake. The murmur of 30 voices all being decently sad. And down the narrow stair comes Blanche Merrow, and around her throat, lifted from the bedroom drawer not 2 hours before, lies the rope of Holt pearls. She had put them on. She had gone up to the dead woman's bedroom, opened the dead woman's drawer, taken out the rope, and fastened it round her own neck to wear at the dead woman's funeral tea, and she came down wearing them as though they had always been hers. The room turned to look, the way a room does. And the pearls did their work. They were good pearls, old and warm and well matched, and in the firelight they glowed against Blanche's black dress, and a little sound went round the room. Admiration. Aren't they fine? Weren't they Honoria's? Doesn't she wear them well? Blanche lifted a hand and turned the rope in her fingers so it caught the light, slow, for everyone to see. Honoria would have wanted them worn, she said, not shut away in a drawer to go dull. And she smiled, sad and gracious, the very picture of a grieving relation honouring the dead. And Ellen stood at the urn and watched the pearls that Honoria had promised her with her own dying voice glowing at another woman's throat, and said nothing. She reached for a cup. She filled it. She held it out to the nearest mourner with a steady hand. "Tea?" she said. That was all. Tea, her whole heart in that one small word, and no one heard it but you. That was the loudest moment of the whole afternoon, and the quietest woman in the room made no sound at all. Now the murmurs turned, the way murmurs do, and they turned against the wrong person. Because the room had decided what Blanche was. Blanche was the family, the mistress, the one in the pearls. And what, then, was the woman at the urn? A neighbour began to wonder aloud, low, to her friend, and who is she, the one pouring? The plain one. Some woman that did for her at the end, I heard. A help of some kind. A help. Staff, the woman who had sold her husband's watch to spare Honoria 11 shillings of shame, was, in that crowded parlour, a help of some kind. That is what the room decided. And Ellen, who could hear a good deal from where she stood, heard that too, and kept her hands busy, and did not correct it. It was not in her to stand up in that room and say who she was. She had spent 4 years being no one's business but Honoria's. She did not know how to be otherwise, and while her hands moved among the cups, her mind went back. It went back to a night, months before, one of the bad nights, when Honoria could not sleep. The old woman had gripped her hand in the dark, and there had been real fear in her, not the fear of dying, something else. "They'll come, Ellen," she had said. "When I'm gone, they'll come, and they'll pick this house like a carcass. I've seen it done. I saw them do it to my own mother's house before she was cold. Everything carried off and divided, and the one who stayed left with nothing but the sweeping up." Ellen had shushed her and stroked her hair and told her not to fret, that it was a long way off, that she was not going anywhere yet. And Honoria had said, "You don't know them, but I do." And she had lain awake a long while after, staring at the ceiling, thinking her own thoughts, planning something Ellen could not see. Ellen had thought it only an old woman's night fear. Standing now at the urn, watching the house picked exactly as Honoria had foretold, she understood it had been something more than fear. It had been foresight. Honoria had seen this very afternoon. She had seen it coming clear as day. And Ellen, pouring tea, wondered for the first time what a woman who could see a thing coming might have done to meet it. She would find out. But not yet. A little while into the tea, an old woman touched Ellen's sleeve at the urn. Mrs. Salt, a widow from down the lane, a quiet body with sharp, kind eyes. She had known Honoria 50 years. She leaned in close, under the noise of the room, and spoke low so only Ellen could hear. She spoke to the vicar, Mrs. Salt said. 3 weeks back, before she went so far down, she had him come to the house, and she talked, and he wrote, and Cobbold and I, we put our marks to it. Both of us. We were there. She pressed Ellen's arm once, firm. "I don't rightly know all that was in it, my dear, but there was something. She saw to something, before the end. You mind that?" And then she straightened up and moved off, as though she had only stopped to say the tea was good. Ellen stood very still. 3 weeks back, the vicar had come, and Honoria had talked, and it had been written down, and 2 neighbours had set their marks to it as witnesses, a thing done in the last clear weeks of a clear mind. She did not know what was in it. But you are beginning to, aren't you? You saw the vicar hold the folded paper. You saw the photograph on the mantel. You are putting it together, quietly, the way the audience always sees the trap before the one who walked into it does. Because here is where you know more than anyone in that room. You know a witnessed paper exists, taken down in Honoria's own words, marked by Mrs. Salt and by Cobbold the wheelwright. You know what the photograph over the fire shows. You know the pearls in the picture and the pearls at Blanche's throat are one and the same rope. Blanche does not know any of this. She thinks possession is the whole of it. She thinks that what is round her neck is hers, because it is round her neck. She does not know she has chosen the one object in that entire house whose ownership is fixed in glass on the mantel behind her. She does not know a clergyman across the room is turning a folded paper over and over in his coat pocket. She knows nothing. And you know everything. That gap is where the whole afternoon lives now. The only question left is when. and Blanche, God help her, made the gap wider with every passing minute. The tea loosened her. She grew warm and expansive, the way a woman does when a room has decided to admire her. She began to talk of plans. She would have the rope looked at in Stamford, she said, cleaned properly. They've a man there who does it beautifully. These old pearls go grey if they're neglected. She talked of the smaller things, what might be sold, what was worth keeping, what was only sentiment and could go. She stood in the dead woman's parlour, wearing the dead woman's pearls, and planned aloud how she would clean them and where she would sell the rest, while the woman who had earned every one of those pearls poured her a second cup. Every word she said tightened the trap another notch. And she could not hear it. Only you could. The Reverend Merton heard it too. Merton had been watching those pearls all afternoon. He was a man who disliked a spectacle above almost anything, and here was spectacle in its purest form. A woman parading a dead friend's jewels at the dead friend's own funeral tea. It offended something deep in him. But he was not a man to make a scene. Making a scene was, to him, only a second spectacle laid on top of the first. So he stood by the window, and he held his paper, and he weighed his duty against his dislike of noise, and he watched. And then Ellen did the one thing that was hers to do. It was a small thing. If you had been in that room, you might have missed it entirely. The photograph on the mantel had been knocked, some time in the crush of the afternoon, a shoulder or an elbow catching it, and it had fallen face down on the mantel shelf. The one likeness of Honoria Vane, lying on its face above her own fire, with 30 people in the room, and not one of them troubling to set it up. Ellen saw it. She set down the teapot. She crossed the room, quietly, not toward Blanche, not toward anyone. She went to the mantel. She lifted the little black frame and stood it upright again. And she took the cuff of her sleeve and wiped the glass, slow and careful, the way you would wipe a child's face. Honoria looked out from the glass once more, stiff and proud in her best dark dress, the pale rope plain at her throat. Ellen looked at her for a moment. Then she went back to the urn and picked up the teapot and went on pouring. She accused no one. She said not a single word. She did not point. She did not glance at Blanche's throat. She did not so much as sigh. She simply picked the dead woman up off her face and set her back in the light where she could see the room. That was all. She put the witness back on its feet. She did not know it was a witness. She only knew Honoria should not be lying face down at her own tea. But you know what she did? She turned the photograph back to face the room, on the very afternoon it was most needed, without the least idea she had done anything at all. And now the picture looks out over all their heads, over Blanche's shoulder, over the pearls, the pale rope in the glass and the warm rope at the throat, the two of them in the same firelight at last, for anyone with eyes to line them up. The vicar had eyes. He looked at the photograph, newly upright, dusted, catching the light. He looked at the pearls turning at Blanche's throat. He looked, quietly, across the crowded room, and found the face of Mrs. Salt, and held it a moment. And Mrs. Salt gave him the smallest nod a person can give, and still call it a nod. Then he found, near the door, the broad weathered face of Cobbold the wheelwright, and Cobbold, seeing the question in the vicar's look, gave him the same small nod back. Two witnesses. A photograph. A paper in his pocket in the dead woman's own words, and a room full of people who had made up their minds about entirely the wrong woman. The Reverend Josiah Merton drew a slow breath. He did not like what he was about to do. It went against every quiet bone in him. But he had given his word to a dying woman 3 weeks ago, in this very house, with his own hand holding the pen, and a man's word to the dying is not a thing he could set down as easily as a teacup. He reached into his coat, and his fingers closed on the folded paper, and across the warm, murmuring, wrong-headed room, over the rim of his cup, he looked one last time at the pearls at Blanche Merrow's throat, and then at the woman standing forgotten at the urn, with the teapot steady in her hand. And he began to move toward the middle of the room. He crossed the floor the way a man crosses ice, slow, careful of his own weight. The murmur of the room did not stop for him, not at first. Why would it? He was only the vicar, and vicars move through funeral teas the way a clock moves through an afternoon, expected and half-noticed. But he stopped in the middle of them. And he stood there with the folded paper in his hand, and he waited. That was all. He waited. And the waiting did what no raised voice could have done. One by one the little knots of talk came apart. A cup found its saucer. Somebody's chair scraped and then went still. The woman of 50 who had been laughing at something near the window let the laugh die in her throat, and the warm, wrong-headed room turned its face, slowly, to the small grey man standing in the heart of it. "Forgive me," said the Reverend Josiah Merton. "I don't care for speeches. You all know that of me. A few soft sounds, agreement, affection even, he was theirs. He had married half of them and buried the other half's mothers. So I'll not make one," he said. "But I was charged with a thing 3 weeks ago in this house, and I find I cannot leave the day without doing it." Over at the urn, Ellen Vane stood with the teapot in her 2 hands and did not move. She had heard the room go quiet. She had felt it the way you feel a draught under a door. And she looked at the vicar, and then, without meaning to, she looked at Mrs. Salt by the wall, and Mrs. Salt was already looking back at her. Merton lifted the paper. He did not unfold it yet. He held it up, only so they could see the thing was real. Common paper. A fold worn soft, and along the bottom, if you were near enough, 2 marks in 2 different hands. 3 weeks before she died, he said, Mrs. Vane asked me to sit with her. Not for prayers. She'd had her prayers. She asked me to take down her wishes, in her own words, while her mind was clear and her hand was not. And she asked 2 of her neighbours to come and hear her say them, and to set their marks that she'd said them freely. He turned the paper over in his fingers. There was another slip pinned to the back of it, a smaller one, and his thumb rested on that a moment. "Mrs. Salt," he said, "you were one." The room's head swung. Mrs. Salt, a widow from down the lane, 50 years a friend of the dead woman, straightened where she stood. "I was," she said, "plain as bread. I heard her. I set my mark. And Mr. Cobbled, near the door, the wheelwright shifted his broad weight off the frame he'd been leaning on. 'Aye,' said Cobbled, 'I heard her and all. That's my mark. The second one.' And there it was. 2 voices in the room, out loud that no one could take back. A little cold ran under the warmth of the tea and the fire. You could see it travel. You could see the woman of 50 glance at the man beside her, quick, the way people glance when they begin to suspect they have been standing in the wrong place all afternoon. Blanche Merrow felt it too. She was near the hearth, where she had been all through the tea, so the firelight could do its work on the pearls. And she laughed, a small bright laugh, the kind that is meant to put a room back where it was. "Well," she said, "how solemn we've all gone. Josiah, dear, it's a funeral, not an assize. Read your list if you must, but let the poor woman rest, and let us have our tea." She meant it kindly. That was the terrible part. She truly did not know. She reached up, half without thinking, and turned the rope once at her throat, so it caught the light, and she smiled around the room as if to gather them all back to her side. And behind her, on the mantel, the photograph looked out over her shoulder. Honoria seated stiff in her Nottingham best, a pale rope of pearls at her throat. The same rope, the very same, coil for coil, in the same firelight now, 15 years apart. Merton did not look at Blanche. He had told himself he would not. And he did not. He looked instead at the paper, and he unpinned the small slip from the back of it, and he read that first, to himself, his lips barely moving. Ellen was near enough to catch only that his eyes narrowed once, and steadied. The slip was a jeweller's note, Pettifer, of Nottingham. Restrung, it said, in 51. 1 rope. Provenance set down in a clerk's careful hand, Ezra Holt to his daughter, in 39, when the lace trade was good and a father could give his girl a thing worth giving. Holt to Holt. Named, dated, kept. He folded the little slip back behind the paper. He did not read it out. He didn't need to. It was the ground he stood on, and a man does not read out the ground he stands on. He simply knows it holds. "I'll read her words," he said, as she said them. No more than that. She numbered her things and named who was to have each. That's all this is. A list. He opened the paper. "My workbox of rosewood," he read, "the one with the brass, to my niece, Judith, who admired it as a girl." A little stir near the window. The rosewood workbox, the one Blanche had lifted into her cart the first afternoon, no one will miss this, belonged by name to another woman entirely. Somebody looked at Blanche. Blanche did not see it. Her smile had gone a degree stiffer, that was all. "The parlour clock," Merton read, "to my nephew, for his own mantle." And there was the clock that had gone into a thin cousin's carpet bag before the coffin was cold, named to a man who had not thought to ask for it. The room was very quiet now. The list was not accusing anyone. That was the awful, gentle weight of it. It only named, and in naming it laid each thing that had walked out of the house against the name it should have walked toward, and let the room do its own arithmetic. Ellen stood at the urn with the pot growing cold in her hands. She had not been told this. Mrs. Salt had told her only that the paper existed. 3 weeks back, Cobbold and I put our marks. She had not known what was written on it. She had assumed, because she always assumed it, that her name would not be among the names. That standing was a thing spoken by people with more right to speak than she had. "The linen and the plate," Merton read on, flat as a man reading a bill, to be shared among the cousins as they see fit. She was fond of them, though they came seldom. That last was Honoria's own dry hand showing through. Though they came seldom. A few faces coloured, Blanche's among them, though she did not yet understand why her heart had begun to knock. And then the vicar came to the last line. He did not change his voice for it. That was the whole of his genius, if a quiet man can be said to have genius. He read it exactly as flat as he had read the linen and the plate. "The rope of pearls," he read. "Holt to Holt, restrung by Pettifer, the same shown in my likeness on the mantle." He paused there, only long enough to take a breath. Every eye in the room, without being told, went from the paper in his hand to the photograph on the mantle, and from the photograph to the pearls at Blanche Merrow's throat, and the line of sight ran through all three like a thread pulled tight. "To Ellen," he read. "Who stayed?" He let the paper fall closed. "To Ellen, who stayed," he said again, in his own voice this time, mild and low. "Those are her words. I only wrote them down." For a moment the room did not move at all. 30 people in a parlour built for 12, and not one of them breathed loud enough to hear. Then every head that had not already turned not to the vicar, to the urn, to the woman standing behind it with the teapot going cold in her hands and the steam long gone from the spout, the woman they had taken all afternoon for the help. Ellen Vane, who stayed. Blanche Merrow's hand went to her throat. It went up on its own, the way a hand goes to a wound before the mind has named the hurt. Her fingers found the rope, closed on it, held it, and then could not do the next thing, whatever the next thing was to have been. Because there was nowhere for the next thing to go. You could watch it happen to her. You could watch the ground she'd stood on all afternoon go out from under her, plank by plank, and no new plank to step to. She could not say she hadn't known which rope it was. The note named it. Holt to Holt, restrung by Pettifer, the same in the likeness. That was not the good rope in the bedroom drawer, I dare say. That was this rope, at her throat, in the light. She could not say Honoria had meant them for her, out of love, out of blood. The words named someone else. To Ellen, who stayed. There was no crack in that to slip a claim through. And she could not, this was the trap closing last, and hardest, she could not turn it into a family quarrel. She could not say the old woman was doting, or that the carer had leaned on her, or that blood was blood and a niece by marriage was no true kin, because it was not Ellen accusing her. Ellen had not said a word. Ellen was standing at the urn with a teapot, saying nothing, as she had said nothing all afternoon. It was a clergyman reading a list. Before two neighbours who had set their marks, under a photograph 15 years old. There was no one to quarrel with. There was only the list and the picture and the plain fact of what she wore. Blanche looked, once, at the mantle, at the pale rope in the glass. She had never once looked at it before. It had sat behind her all afternoon while she turned the warm one in the firelight, and she had never seen the woman in the frame wearing the very thing at her throat. Now she saw nothing else. Her hand came down from the rope, and in the whole silent room she did the only thing that was left to her, which was the thing the words had already done to her, only with her own fingers. She reached behind her neck. She found the clasp. Her fingers were not steady, and it took her a moment, fumbling, in front of 30 people who did not help her and did not look away. The clasp gave. She drew the rope from her throat, still warm, and she held it a moment in both hands, cupped, the way you hold water you know you cannot keep. Then she stepped to the tea tray by the urn, right up beside Ellen, near enough to touch, though neither of them touched the other, and she laid the pearls down on the tray, coiled, beside the cooling pot. "I only thought them safe with me," she said. It was small. It was the whole of her defence, and it was 3 seconds long, and it fell into the quiet, and no one caught it. No one answered her. Not the vicar, not the room, not Ellen, who did not so much as look up. Blanche stood there another moment with her empty hands, waiting for someone to take her part, to say, of course you did, dear, and no one did. And she understood, at last, that no one would. It was Cobbold who broke the silence, the wheelwright. A man with sawdust worn into the creases of his hands, who had leaned by the door all afternoon and said nothing, because it was not his place, until it was. "I set my mark to it," he said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room the way a heavy thing fills a room. Mrs. Salt did likewise. We heard the old lady say every word of it, of her own accord, with her wits about her. It's her word, right enough. I'll stand behind it in any court in Rutland, if it comes to that, though I don't reckon it will. He looked round at them, slow, taking his time. A workingman above them all for one plain minute, on the one point that mattered. "I don't reckon it will," he said again, "because there's the paper, and there's the picture, and there's the two of us. What's to argue?" And Mrs. Salt, from the wall, added only, 50 year I knew her. She never said a thing she didn't mean. And she meant that. Something moved in the room then. You could feel it turn, the whole heavy sentiment of it, like a cart coming round in a lane. All afternoon these same people had murmured, and "Who's the one pouring then?" and placed Ellen below the salt without a second thought, hired help in a borrowed black dress. Now the murmurs ran the other way. A woman near the fire drew her skirts aside, though Ellen had not moved toward her. A man stood, without quite knowing why he stood, and then, having stood, could not think how to sit again while she was on her feet. A chair scraped back. And another. Making way. Making room. For the woman at the urn. Ellen felt it as a kind of pressure lifting. She had braced herself so long against being no one that being seen was almost more than she could bear. Her eyes stung. She kept them on the tray, on the coiled pearls beside the pot. Merton folded the paper along its worn crease and put it back inside his coat, over his heart, where it had ridden all afternoon. He was not a man who liked to be looked at, and he could feel the room's gratitude turning toward him now, and he wanted none of it. "There's no cleverness in this," he said, mildly, before they could make him a hero. "I want you all to understand that. Mrs. Vane wasn't laying a trap. She was sparing you one. A wish spoken out loud, before witnesses and written down, that's a real thing, as real as any paper drawn up in a lawyer's office in Stamford. She knew that. She'd seen enough in 68 years to know it." He looked for the first time at the photograph. "She foresaw this very afternoon," he said. "She told me so, near enough, 3 weeks ago. She said they'll come and pick the house like a carcass when I'm gone, and the one who stayed will stand in the corner and paw, and be too decent to say a word for herself. She said, 'I'll not have a quarrel over my coffin, Josiah, so I'll say it now, and you'll say it after, and then there's nothing to quarrel about. It'll all be said.' He spread his hands, a small helpless gesture. 'That's all I've done,' he said. 'Said it after, as I promised her I would.' And that was the end of the reading. He did not name Blanche. He did not have to. He did not scold the cousins who had carried off the clock and the workbox. He did not need to. He had let the list do it, flat, in a dead woman's words, and there is no reframing a list. You cannot call a list a slight. You cannot weep at a list, or wound it, or take offence. It simply is what she said. And what she said was Ellen. Now every eye came back to her and stayed, and she understood that it was hers to move, that the room had gone still and made a space and put down its long mistake, and that it was waiting, at last, for the woman it had overlooked. Ellen Vane set down the teapot. It was a small sound, china on wood, but in that silence it carried. She had been holding it, she realized, for the whole of the vicar's reading, the way a person holds a rail on a moving thing. Now she let it go. She wiped her hands once on the black stuff of her borrowed skirt. Then she reached to the tray and lifted the pearls. 30 people watched her do it. They expected, you could feel them expect it, that she would put them on, that she would clasp the warm rope at her own throat and take, in front of them all, the thing that was now hers by name. It would have been only just. Not one soul in the room would have grudged it her. She did not put them on. She carried them across the floor instead. The room parted for her, quiet, the same floor she had crossed 100 times that afternoon, with a pot in her hand and no one marking her passage. She crossed it now, and they marked every step. She went to the mantel, to the photograph, newly upright, dusted with her own cuff not an hour since, Honoria seated stiff in her Nottingham best with the pale rope at her throat, and Ellen laid the pearls down at the foot of the frame. Coiled, careful, so the warm rope lay beneath the pale one in the glass, the two of them together, at last, in the same firelight. The way they were always meant to sit. She straightened. She turned only halfway, so she was speaking as much to the picture as to the room. "She told me the pearls were mine," Ellen said. Her voice was not steady, but it did not break. 4 years ago, near enough, before her hands went. She said, "The pearls are yours, Ellen. You'll know why." She looked at the coiled rope and the pale one above it. "I never did know why," she said. "I thought maybe she was wondering. Old folk say things. I never once thought she meant it, or that it would ever come to more than words between the two of us in a cold room at night." She drew a breath. "I know why now," she said. "She didn't leave me the pearls because they were worth anything. She left them so I'd have to be named. So somebody would have to stand up in a full room and say my name out loud, because I never would have said it myself." A small, wet sound that was nearly a laugh. She knew me. 4 years, she knew me. She meant I shouldn't have to say it myself. That was all. She had promised nothing, but the room had understood, somehow, that whatever she said would be few words, and it was. She turned back to the urn. She picked up the teapot again, because it was cold now and wanted filling, and there were still 30 people who had come a long way and would want their tea before the roads got dark. But no one let her pour it. Mrs. Salt was there first, taking the pot out of her hands. Gentle, firm, "You sit," said Mrs. Salt. 50 years I let her boss me. "You'll let me do this one thing. Sit down, Ellen Vane, and be still in your own house." Her own house. It was the first anyone had said it. Ellen sat. Blanche Merrow did not stay to see the tea poured by another hand. She gathered her shawl, and she went, quietly, out through the little press of people who a moment before had admired her and now only stepped back to let her by. She had come across the county line twice in 15 years. She went out over it a third time that evening, before the plates were cleared, and she did not look at the mantel on her way, and she did not say goodbye to the woman in the chair. The last anyone in Nether Dunthorpe saw of Blanche Merrow was her back and the empty place at her throat where the firelight used to catch. She did not write after, but 3 weeks on, a parcel came by carrier, and inside it, wrapped in newspaper with no letter at all, was the parlour clock, and the rosewood workbox with the inlaid lid and the brass fittings. Returned unremarked, set down on the road back the way they'd come. There are people who cannot say they were sorry, and post a clock instead. Ellen understood it for what it was, and did not require more of her. The house grew quiet after that day, and then slowly it grew warm. 6 months on, come the turn of the year, Thistle House was not the damp small place Honoria had died by inches in. Ellen had aired it. She had kept the fires up in rooms that had stood cold for want of coal and want of someone who thought them worth the warming. The memorandum had a provision in it that the vicar had not read out that afternoon, because it had not been the moment for it, that the one who stayed should have the roof over her while she needed it. So Ellen lived in the house she had nursed a woman to death in. It was hers to be in, by a wish spoken aloud 3 weeks before the end, and marked by 2 neighbours who heard it. She kept the photograph on the mantel where it had always been, and at the foot of the frame she kept the pearls, coiled, just as she had laid them down at the tea. She did not wear them. Some said she ought to. A rope like that, they said, holt to holt, restrung by Pettifer, worth a year of most men's wages, a woman would be a fool to leave it lying on a mantel gathering the firelight. But Ellen only said they suited the picture, and when the low winter sun came through the parlour glass of an afternoon, it reached the mantel, and it lit the pale rope in the frame and the warm rope beneath it both together, and anyone who saw it said no more about fools. They still tell it in Nether Dunthorpe. It has worn down to a saying, the way the best of them do, so that folk repeat it who have forgotten there was ever a real Tuesday behind it, and a real cold parlour, and a real teapot going cold in a real woman's hands. A will can be broke, they say, but a photograph on the mantel cannot. And they are nearly right, but not quite. Because it was not the photograph in the end that did it. A photograph cannot speak. A list cannot stand up in a crowded room of its own accord. It took a 50-year friend to set her mark, and a wheelwright to say "I" out loud when it would have been easier to keep leaning on the door frame. It took a quiet vicar who hated a scene to make the one scene he had ever made in his life, because a man's word to the dying is not a thing he could set down like a teacup. And it took an old woman, 68 and 3 years a widow's aunt, who saw the whole afternoon coming from 3 weeks off, and would not be there to fix it, and so fixed it in advance, in her own words, because she already knew exactly who would come to her tea, and who would pour it, and who would never ever speak up for herself. Possession, they say, is 9 points of the law. Perhaps it is. Blanche Merrow had possession that afternoon. She had the rope warm at her throat and 30 people admiring her, and every reason to believe the thing was settled, because she wore it and no one else did, and she was wrong. Because there is a 10th point, and the 10th point is a woman with a clear mind and a steady witness, writing it down 3 weeks before she dies, so that possession never gets the last word. The pearls could have gone out the door that evening on whoever's neck they happened to sit. That is how these things usually go. The strong hand, the quick cousin, the cart already loaded, and the one who stayed left standing in the corner with nothing but a spoken promise no one heard. It very nearly went that way. It goes that way more often than not. But it didn't. Not this once. This once the pearls sit on a warm mantle in a house that breathes again at the foot of the face that gave them, where the winter light can find them of an afternoon, because one tired old woman thought ahead, because 2 neighbours told the truth, and because one quiet man chose, against every bone in him, to stand up in the middle of a crowded room and read a list and let a photograph do the rest. If this one stayed with you, if you've ever been the one in the corner, pouring, while someone else wore what you earned, tell me the name of your town in the comments, and I'll read it, and I'll think of you there.